With that, I'm going to turn it over to our contributor, Lorum Ipsum. He's a new contributor of ours. We're very glad to have him on Tochnyi. And he has been working in the economics of the energy industry for over 20 years. So he's going to talk to us about the current state of the Russian oil industry in light of the Ukrainian attacks. So over to you, Lorum Ipsum.
Thanks. Just double checking you can hear me, right? I want to make sure my audio is good.
Loud and clear.
All right. So since it's all good, there's an image that, yep, it's already up. I see that. So just taking a step back, if you look at what the Russian economy was for the data reported from 2022 in terms of exports and in terms of export destinations, you can see how heavily concentrated it is, not just around energy or not just on crude, but also around energy more broadly. So, crude, 28%, petroleum gas, obviously they're 15%, refined petroleum, 14%. You see there in the image coal briquettes, but that's just a small portion of the entire coal extraction industry. But even that is 7.5%. So you're looking at roughly 60% that is objectively tangible for energy industry extraction. And if you were to go through that graph and drill down around what was, the other extractive industries, right? So gold, wheat, et cetera, you're going to see the overwhelming majority there is an extractive industry that is sold into the global market. And obviously take this with a grain of salt. It's the 2022 data. These are leading indicators, right? So this is showing what was delivered in 2022, not what was ordered in 2022. The future forward projection of this data would obviously be much more skeptical. If you skip forward to the next slide, so here's a slide on just natural gas exports, right? And natural gas, keep in mind, is the core of the Russian economic model, right? The Yamal gas fields that were feeding the European natural gas market, Germany, France, Poland, Slovakia, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at this chart, it's very illustrative. LNG is a tiny percentage. LNG just, I apologize if I'm over explaining here. LNG, liquefied natural gas. This is a very complex transfer system. You need to take gas from specific pipelines. You need to put it on specific ships through specific liquefaction terminals. Those ships then need to go to specific ports on the destination end that have specific gasification terminals, and then can actually take that gas to market. So it's not something that can easily be built out. But even in the run-up to 2021, as you see that dark blue part of the chart expand, that is a very small percentage of their overall market. Most of that light blue, the overwhelming majority of that light blue, is what was sent by Gazprom from Yamal to Western Europe in one way or another, whether it was through the overland pipelines, through Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, or whether it was through the undersea pipelines from Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Obviously, those two pipelines that I just mentioned were shut down. Well, Nord Stream 1 was shut down by Russia several months prior to its explosion, and Nord Stream 2 was never operational. But to be clear, the main delta in terms of Russia's natural gas energy export capacity was around LNG. So if we can just go to the next slide. All right, so these are the, this is a very generalized graph. So you see the sites that have been hit by Ukrainian drone strikes. Those are not necessarily offline, to be clear. But if you look around St. Petersburg and you look around the Kerch Peninsula, those clusters are the main export capacity for Russian LNG. And hitting those, and we don't know what the exact consequences were, but hitting those is a critical blow to Russia's ability to export LNG and crude oil. Crude oil is much more fungible. Then take the middle of that graphic, right? From Belgorod, Kursk, all the way around to, I guess that would be what, Saratov, and all the way up to Nizhny Novgorod, and then back around down towards Moscow. All of those red sites. That's all the refining capacity. That's the ability of Russia to, produce gasoline, jet fuel, and all of the variations of jet fuel. So there's two separate questions. The ability of Russia to make money by exporting LNG and crude oil and refined products, and that's represented around Petersburg and around Rostov and around Kerch. And then there's the ability for Russia to provide refined products for the people who need it, whether those be civilians, whether that's military. And that's the middle. From Belgorod, Kursk, east to Saratov, up to Nizhny Novgorod, and around towards Moscow. And we don't know exactly what damage was done to each facility. These facilities are well designed, to be clear. They are not single point of failure facilities. So just because a facility was hit does not mean that it was taken offline or that its capacity is necessarily discounted from the overall equation that you're putting towards whether it's export or whether it's domestic production. The next slide. Just breaking down the refining graph for Russia, as you can see, the majority of what Russia produces and brings to market is crude, unrefined crude oil. And then the second biggest component of that is either gas oil or diesel. So the more exotic refined products have always been marginal for them, but those are the ones they might need in terms of a domestic supply emergency. And so what I was saying to a bunch of people on the stream when we did a stream on Friday was there's two questions. One, how does this affect the Russian economy long term? Well, you can see that in the purple graph right there, and a bit on the very dark red graph. Two, what does this mean for the Russian ability to keep its mobilized forces in the field and to also keep its civilians able to travel from A to B? And that would be the three middle shades of red to a lighter degree. When you factor in aircraft, it gets a bit more complicated, but that's the rough summation. Next point. So if you can see on this graph, Yamal is the major nexus of Gazprom's Western Siberian gas fields. And if you see those two red lines, where do they point? They lead into Germany. They lead into, they both lead into Germany. And then you have a potential line that goes into Vienna, but there's no connection from those gas fields to either an LNG point, aside from Petersburg, which, as we discussed previously, was threatened if not taken offline. And there's no through point to China. If you look on the right side of that image, the Eastern Siberian pipelines, that's Power Siberia 1. The goal that Russia has is to connect Yamal, which is in the top center of that image, to the Eastern Siberian network, which is in the right side of that image. That's Power Siberia 2. And China has made it very clear they have no intention of improving this pipeline. That pipeline will take 10 years to make, and at least $500 billion mark in USD, maybe more, maybe closer to $1 trillion. So Russia's ability to sell the gas, and Russia's, but also Gazprom's ability to sell the gas that they were selling routinely and at a very good profit to Western Europe up until 2022 from Yamal is entirely compromised for the next decade. And that is not something that they can solve within the next decade unless they have, even if they have massive capital expenditure. and the capital expenditure is not going to be easy to come by. All right, last image. So this is Yamal. As you can see, these are the different facilities. The one thing that I was asked a lot in the last 2 weeks was, if you could hit anywhere in Russia, where would you hit? And I said, Yamal, hit me there. There's a lot of facilities there. These are very, very, very large refineries, extraction points, through points, terminals, storage points. If you hit this, though, this would, if you could square delete what's on the map right here, that would bankrupt Gazprom. And this is obviously beyond the supposedly established range of what Ukraine can hit. But if they could hit this, this would absolutely cripple the ability of Russia to provide natural gas exports, which is already very, very limited. But if they could do this, this would absolutely cripple that capacity. That's their main funding, and that's also the main source for their industry. So if you could pick one target, this would be it. Happy to take questions on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lorum. I don't know if there are any questions from the people in the panel, or did we get any in chat? Yeah, we did. I'll just start with this one from Thierry. From what you said, most of the gas is now sold to China. Is the Amur Gas Terminal the right place to be targeted to stop that gas delivery?
Sorry, to be clear, there's very little gas sold to China. The oil is sold to China. You know, and this is something maybe I should have highlighted before. Oil is very easy to put on a ship, right? All you need is an oil tanker. To put natural gas on a ship and ship it, you need the right pipelines. You need a liquefaction terminal on the supplier end, and then you need a gasification terminal on the buyer end. And in between, you also need a very specific type of ship, which is very hard. So Russia's ability to sell its oil is very hard to impinge, and we were not really trying to impinge it. Russia can put oil, as it does, on its dark fleets in the Baltic and in the Aegean, right, where the oil is transferred ship to ship without registration and is untrackable, or they just sell it directly to India, who arbitrages the price difference from the price cap. Oil is very easy for Russia. Natural gas is the real issue, and you cannot simply transfer that unless you have, and they've already maxed out their LNG capacity, which means, you know, selling natural gas via ship, seaborne natural gas. And in order for them to actually monetize their natural gas assets, the assets they were selling into Europe, you know, very profitably for the last 20 years, for them to monetize those assets for another market is going to take 10 years and a massive amount of capital expenditure. And they can't afford that, either in time or money.
Yeah, thanks. We also got another question on, I think delete only means LNG, not LPG, but why is, I guess, LNG a good target? Is it just that it's uniquely vulnerable?
It's not that it's uniquely vulnerable, although it is quite vulnerable. I don't presume to speak about what air defense assets are around those terminals, but it is a very explicit single point of failure in the Russian energy infrastructure. So if you could hit it, that would be the place to hit it. There's no ability for Russia to replace that capacity were it taken out in the short to medium term. So if you had Terminal X, right, liquefaction Terminal X, let's call it, you know, right outside St. Petersburg, and that were taken out by a strike, how long would it take you to replace that capacity? In the best of circumstances, 3 to 5 years. These are not simple systems. This is not taking crude oil and pumping it onto a tanker. These are very complex systems. and it requires a lot of technology that presumably they would have either a hard time getting from the West or a very steep price to pay when buying from China. So that would be the most prominent single point of failure.
Yeah, so I also got a question from Jonathan. Please go ahead, Jonathan.
Thanks, Alan. Lauren, I was just wondering, this video that we can see here, could you tell us what you think in terms, how much damage do you think has been caused here, and what would you say is the estimated repair time from this strike?
It's a very good question, and this is not my video. I've seen this video before. I can see it right now, and it does allude to a point that I was making earlier on a different podcast, which is, these refineries that are being hit, whether it's a refinery, a fuel depot, whether it's a pipeline network that's been hit over the last 3 to 4 weeks, these are well-designed facilities that do not necessarily have a lot of single points of failure. And this video is a good example of that, where it's probably not going to be as significant as one would think if one were coming to it de novo. It depends exactly where it hit. I can't speak exactly as to where it hit in that facility. But given that these facilities are generally the size of, and as this facility is in particular, the size of, 5 to 10 Manhattan city blocks, it really depends about exactly where the damage is done. But there's a lot of redundancy, as there are, not just in Russian plants or refineries, but also, worldwide. This is not a uniquely Russian thing, although I've heard that proposed that Russians are uniquely redundant in their oil refining capacity. But anyway, this facility almost certainly has significant redundant ability to maintain some operations for some parts of its capability. So I think it's best to underestimate. That's the safest bet. Maybe it's a certain portion of its refining capacity that's offline for 3 to 6 weeks. Maybe it is one very specific portion of that that's offline for 6 to 8 months. And maybe it's a portion of its inputs, if it hit a pipeline, that's offline, whether it's 3 to 6 weeks or 3 to 6 months. But there's going to be a lot of parts of that facility that are very much operational, probably, starting within 24 hours.
Is it fair to say that when these facilities were designed and constructed, they weren't done so with being struck by Ukrainian deep strike UAVs in mind? So
No,
they're vulnerable in that respect.
they were definitely not designed with Ukrainian UAVs in mind, but they were designed because, with the fact that at the end of the day, a refinery is essentially super boiling a rigid steel container to separate different parts of hydrocarbons into different tubes, which means your shelf life of your components is very, very, very short. So there's a lot of redundancy built into the system. Some facilities will be designed with strategic threats in mind. So there was a facility in East Germany that was essentially the basis of the East German economy between the 1950s and the 1970s. It was completely fed by inputs from the Soviet Union. And that facility was one of the most heavily fortified facilities in the entire DDR, because they knew that if that facility went offline, they were unable to provide even basic functions for not only their military, but also their civilian population. So that's one extreme. And that, I'm not saying that everything's like that, but there are, design elements in these facilities, especially those from the former Eastern Bloc, that definitely incorporate redundancy. I'll put it that way.
I think Bionade had a question.
Yeah, actually, we heard this media reports this week that allegedly the U.S. administration told Ukraine to stop hitting Russian refineries because the oil price could be influenced by this. Are there any indicators that this could happen, or is this already happening? What is your opinion on this?
Thank you for bringing this up. This is a really good point. A lot of people who are on this stream, I've already talked to about this. As you can tell in my accent, I have an American passport. I've never been more ashamed to be an American than when I saw that report. It was one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. And there's a certain person in the administration, I'm sure we all know who I'm talking about, who was responsible for that leak. It was absolutely reprehensible for the US government through Jake Sullivan to say that to Ukraine. It's petty. It is economically illiterate for them to say that. And it is borderline craven for them to say that. The election, re-election, or failure to re-elect Joe Biden has nothing to do with Ukraine hitting Russian refineries. Ukraine hitting Russian refineries, pipelines, terminals has a massive impact on Ukraine's ability to defend its sovereignty, to defend its territory, and to negate the Russian ability to wage its criminal war. It has almost no, not just almost no impact, essentially zero impact on the price of gas in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And if the Biden administration is actually concerned about the price of gas in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I have carried a lot of water for the Biden administration for the last 3 years, if they really are concerned about that, then when they drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the last 3 years and had an opportunity to buy back about 2/3 of that when the price of crude was at 60, WTI was at 60, then they should have done it. And if the Biden administration is really going to say with a straight face to the Ukrainian government, you can't hit these Russian facilities because it will impact the price of gasoline in the US in an election season, then the Biden administration has no right to be in government. And I say this as someone who's carried a ton of their water, because this is a very solvable problem. If you're the United States, you can easily solve that marginal difference, right? So say all of the facilities hit by Ukraine went offline tomorrow. You're the United States government. How do you solve that in terms of oil demand and supply, in terms of the price of gasoline in Omaha, Nebraska? How do you solve that? It's very easy. Deploy the SPR, make a phone call to Saudi Arabia. It's not hard, deregulate drilling, which is not going to be a short-term solution, obviously, but prices reflect future expectations, so short-term prices will be impacted by that. You have lots of tools in your chest, and if you're saying to Ukraine that you can't hit these targets that will materially impact your occupiers' ability to occupy your country because we're worried about our domestic gas price, that's bullshit. I'm sorry. Anyone who's making that argument either is completely disingenuous or economically illiterate.
Yeah, I think we need to make clear here the point. We don't have any confirmation that this really happened, right?
That's also true.
Yeah, it's just rumors and this reporting about it. But from the factual point, the attacks from Ukraine wouldn't really have an impact on the market prices, right?
Correct. If every facility that Ukraine hit was taken completely offline, which is nowhere close to being the reality, these will all be partial issues. Let's say every facility Ukraine hit was taken completely offline. The total impact on the global price of oil, crude oil, refined products could be negated with the stroke of a pen that would not to release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve of the United States. And it would be a marginal release, and it would cost no one anything. It could be solved immediately.
All right, thanks for your answer.
I saw
And-
Andrew has joined, so I guess maybe you want to ask something.
Hi. I didn't listen to the whole thing. I'm sorry, but I was wondering if you did you already talk about the strike that was like yesterday?
Just briefly on my news reporting.
Yeah, I was just curious if Lauren wants to talk about that.
The strike that Gick talked about in our other chat.
Yeah,
Is that your,
yeah.
it's a very small facility. Tactically, it may have a huge impact, right? Because the ability to get, whether it's fuel oil, diesel, jet fuel. I don't pretend to know exactly what was stored at that facility, but there's absolutely the potential for, again, it's Sevastopol, right? So there's naval, land, and air components that need to be supplied from there. So hitting that tactically has a huge impact. Hitting that strategically or geostrategically in terms of the market is not a big impact. It's a very small facility. Tactically it could be huge, but strategically it's not moving the needle compared to what Ukraine has done in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, I also saw a question. I think you mentioned it. Basically, the fact that Bjornade said that this is a rumor, etc. But we had a question about the fact that it has been refuted by the White House, etc. We also have a question: wouldn't the loss of refining capacity increase the availability of crude on the market?
I mean, I just want to make sure I'm hearing that question correctly. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, wouldn't the loss of refining capacity increase the availability of crude on the market? That's from.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I misheard you originally. Yes, it would. Just axiomatically, right? If you're unable to refine it, then yes, you have to supply it, but not materially. And you have to remember that OPEC Plus, of which Russia is a part, has cut production quotas consistently over the last 18 months. The difference in what Russia would be supplying to the market in terms of crude that they couldn't refine because refineries were offline is a drop in the bucket compared to the global market. And moreover, it's already under a regime where they are purposely restricting crude production.
Understood. Also, another question that is kind of connected to this: didn't Russia stop oil exports to ensure domestic supply plus sanctions stop India from buying Russian oil?
So, just for background, the story between India and Russia is very interesting because there's a lot of people on Twitter who really think that India was bailing Russia out in 2022 and 2023 in terms of oil sanctions. India was putting Russia over a barrel for those years, right? They were buying at $10 to $15 per barrel below market, and then selling that at cost onto the global market. India was laughing all the way to the bank because they were the only person who would buy the excess Russian oil. Eventually, China came online. That really narrowed the arbitrage down much closer to market price. The ability of Russia to export its crude oil, I mean, crude oil is a very fungible product, is not really impacted. The G7 did their price cap. It did have an impact in that it influenced others' behavior, but it did not enforce that price cap per se. And that a large factor in that is just the lack of global demand. China, being in a massive deflationary spiral, has tanked demand for natural resources, and that's what really has kind of bailed out the global oil market, bailed out global oil buyers. It's absolutely sabotaged global oil sellers. So Russia's ability to sell to India is dependent on India's willingness to arbitrage the market, and there's no longer an arbitrage. There was for 18 months, and India took full advantage.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to ask a question, and then if no one else on the panel has any more questions about this topic, we might go to the next topic. So you kind of touched this, but I think we can maybe expand on it a little bit. Are these refineries legitimate targets for Ukraine? That's my question.
Yes, is the answer. Is the
Yeah.
is the Novakhovka Dam a legitimate target? So if they're hitting that dam, then yes, they are. But these are facilities. Forget about dual use. These are facilities producing fuel oil for tanks and diesel for tanks, and these are facilities producing jet fuel for their air force, without which they could not kill as many Ukrainians as they're trying to kill. So yes, it's the definition of a legitimate target in any circumstance.
And the fact that this might impact civilians in some sort of way, it doesn't really change. It still is a legitimate target.
Nothing about if someone has to pay a higher price it would be a cent. It wouldn't even be a cent higher or 2 cents higher. It could easily be negated. But even then, you can't just ask Ukrainians to die quietly. I'm sorry. These are legitimate targets. Without these facilities, Russia cannot continue its occupation and aggression at the scale that it currently is doing. That's a definition of a legitimate target. You're not targeting civilians. You're not targeting, housing complexes. You're targeting critical infrastructure. While Russia is targeting Novakhovka, it's targeting the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I'm sorry. This is a legitimate target.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Even from the Russian reports, we see, I would say, usually no casualties from these attacks. Sometimes maybe one. And casualty could be injury or death, right? And so, yeah, in terms of if we're talking ethics here or the legitimacy of a target, I think as you were saying, it's the most sort of ethical approach in terms of not killing people and stopping Russia from prosecuting the war, because this is the Russian military budget kind of runs on this, right? We did have one more question in the chat, though, Erlen, I wanted to get to, which was Zero Lad. It's a little bit down there. To what degree is Russia dependent on Western hardware? Do they have the ability to repair multiple damaged facilities? So what does Russian repair capacity look like in light of what's going on?
It's a very complex question, and I don't have the full competence to go through that right, in this audience. I could give you a general overview of that question. I'm not someone who can tell you exactly what piece is going to be needed to repair facility X of subsection Y of refinery Z. I wouldn't pretend to know that. But in terms of overall need for Western technology, it's not as much as you think it is. This is not semiconductors. This is a country that had a oil and gas export business model since essentially 1960. 1970 is more accurate, right? Before that, it was agricultural. So there's no shortage of Russian, former Soviet, mechanical industrial know-how when it comes to building and maintaining refineries, terminals, and pipelines, because that was how they made their money really from the late 60s until the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and obviously for the Russian Federation from its foundation until now. So there's a ton of know-how there. If they don't know how to do that, they don't know how to do anything, is the short answer.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on and contributing.